One book that's been helpful for me is a lot of you are familiar with Chuck Swindoll, I'm sure. He has a character series. You can't buy these in hardback anymore. There are 9 volumes in this series, and they are really, really good. He covers 9 lives. I think the ninth one is on Christ. One called Lessons from Forgotten Lives, with several characters in this book. If you know, these books are not very expensive. I think now in paperback you probably could get it for $7 or $8. But some of you may be familiar with Chuck Swindoll's television program, um, and he also has a radio program too. A Baptist preacher out in Dallas, Texas. But it's a really good study, and it's really been helpful for me. It's not very thick. I mean, it's 193 pages. One thing about Charles Swindoll's stuff is he uses a ghostwriter, and so it's his ideas, but not his writing. And so, but that's a pretty good book. I'm going to draw some thoughts from it today, in addition to some other things. So let's get started with class. Let me hit. Let me move this right here, and hide floating meeting controls, and then here. All right. So as we get into Esther, we looked at last week a brief introduction. The more I've read through this book and studying things about it this week, I said last week the primary purpose is to explain the Feast of Purim. I think as I've studied it, I think that's probably at best a secondary purpose. I think the primary purpose is to show that God has not forgotten his people in captivity. When we were studying First and Second Kings, we went back to a promise of God made to David for Judah, and by extension of the promise made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to Israel, although the Lord did obviously demand judgment from each one of those nations. God was faithful to his promise. And as I study this book, I think the primary purpose is to show that even though God's people were in captivity, he was with them and working behind the scenes to ensure their survival. And the remnant, that you're familiar with that terminology in Isaiah, for example, there's this promised remnant that's going to be preserved amongst the people of Israel and people of Judah. And we see the remnant preserved here. And that culminates in remembering through a feast called Purim, which comes from the Persian word pur, which means to cast lots, which that's how Haman made his decision on how he was going to carry out this extermination of the Jews. But God is with them, God working behind the scenes. Now, as you look at this story, it's interesting to see all the different storylines going on at once, all of them unaware of each other, probably on some level. I guess when something like Vashti opposes a king, that becomes known, but and a royal edict is set out. But as far as Esther ever thinking she would ascend to the position of queen of Medes and Persia, the Medes and Persians, that would be something far-fetched in her mind. Here she is living in exile. So you have all these stories and ways that God secures favor from the Jews, or at least for the Jews, from the Persians. So there are a lot of different things going on here that teaches us quite a bit about God's providential care. Again, we said last week, when we talk about providence, there's a lot of, I don't know and I can't explain to you. I think that's a humbling subject. If each one of us were asked, what is one of the more humbling subjects to think about in the Bible and a biblical topic, I think providence would be right up beside the Holy Spirit. And so it's an interesting study. So I want to look at a couple of things: Vashti's courage and Ahasuerus' cowardice. So a couple of things going on here, and to see what's going on as far as God working through these individuals. Let's begin here in chapter 1, and let's notice a few things here. We notice, first of all, let's see if this thing's hung up with me here. There we go. It just took it a minute to come up. Let me go back here. I remember last week not to use this particular transition. Let's see if I can do it this way. Let's see. Let me go back. Oh, it's hung up on me. Maybe I'll get it working in just a second. Keynote's not been being very friendly with Zoom the last couple of days. But let's notice a few things about this particular incident. It says in verse 1, now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia. If you think about that on a map, if you had one in front of you, a map all the way from India to Ethiopia, you think about the western part of Africa all the way to India, this vast measure of this empire. Another detail is in verse 3. In the third year of his reign, is my understanding that when a king took over during this time, there was a period of time of 3 years when opposition could be leveled against him as far as establishing his authority. It rarely ever happened. And so this banquet that's going to last 180 days is not insignificant. At the end of the third year of his reign, he's officially the king of the Medes and Persians. And as a result of that, he has this large banquet showing the mighty nature of his king, of his empire and his ruling and the power that he has. And he brings people from far and near, from the smallest to the greatest, the text says, to show just how great and grand his empire is. So why 180 days? Well, first of all, he could, number one. And number two, you got to think about travel. If he's bringing, representation from India all the way to Susa, which is in the Middle East, that takes quite a bit of travel, quite a bit of time. Okay, and so we notice some things that are going on here. Let's read verses. Let's begin reading in verses 6 and 7, and I want you to notice some things about the beauty of the kingdom. He's really flexing his muscles. There's really nothing held back in regards to the presentation of the greatness of his kingdom. Now let's read here. Sandra, would you mind to read Esther chapter 1, verses 6 and 7?
Okay, verse 6. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality.
So if you notice here some things, think about the beauty. Think about an entire palace made of mother of pearl. When I think about the descriptions, especially ancient buildings, I think about some of my experiences in Burma and looking at some of those pagodas, with the marble and the gold, or at least things that are painted or gold plated. And looking at the beauty of those things, they want you to show those things off, the rubies, the jade, and so forth. So you see this magnificent palace. The wine is flowing. The drinks are served in golden vessels. If you look at verse 8, he says you can drink as little or as much as you want to. And so when it comes to the nation here in their celebration of him coming to power, he holds nothing back. And so you see this man who's really full of himself. Charles Swindoll actually talks about this and what some sources say about him. He refers to him as the Lion King of the Middle East. And so when it came to his inscriptions about him, this is what was written about him. He says, archaeologists have excavated at Susa and unearthed inscriptions in which the King Ahasuerus, known as Xerxes, king, refers to himself as this way. This is how he referred to himself: the great king, the king of kings, the king of the lands occupied by many races, the king of this great earth. So he viewed himself not only as the king of the Medes and the Persians, but also the entire earth itself. So this guy's pretty full of himself. Now let's notice something else that's going on alongside this. So you got a lot of scenes that you got to balance out and see how God is working through each one. Next is Queen Vashti. If you begin reading about her, she throws verse 9, a feast for the women. And in his drunkenness, beginning in verse 11, he wants to bring what some suggest is his prized possession, his queen, who was known for her beauty. So let's read beginning in verse 11. Chris, would you mind to read verse 11 and 12 for me?
Okay, verse 11.
Yeah.
To bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come as the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him.
We're not sure what it means. Thank you, Chris. We're not sure what it means by her to come to him. A couple of suggestions was made. Number one, for her to come clothed but unveiled, which you know even today in Middle Eastern countries, um, you know, to come anywhere unveiled was something to show immodesty. You know, even now they wear the things that veil all the way up to their eyes. Some suggest that she was to present herself wearing only her crown, which obviously meant for lust and sexual exploitation. And so there are a lot of suggestions what's going on. Whatever that is, okay, she refused. There was something in her. She said, I will not be treated as possession. And she refused to come. Now, I think one of the great overreactions in the Bible is found here in chapter 1. The king and his servants, of course, I think a lesson in this, when you're in a position of power, watch out for yes men. These men, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagatha, Zethar, Carcass, and the 7 eunuchs in verse 10, they're just going to do whatever the king says for them to do. Okay, so when it comes to they just said, you know, whatever the king wants. And we were introduced to a man named Mimikin. He has this idea saying, look, if word gets out that the queen refused the king, wives everywhere will revolt. Of course, that's not what's going to happen. And what we see here is perhaps God working behind the scenes, removing Vashti from power, or at least having her removed. And because if you look at verse 19, look at the end of this discussion. It says in verse 19, if it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is to never to come again to King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to one who is better than she. Now, that's not to downplay the character of Vashti, but as setting the stage for a righteous, godly Jewish girl to save her nation and heavily influence the king. Verse 19 is very important. It's because it's beginning to show what exactly is going on here. All right. And so there's this drunken, irrational decision. When they're making this decision, they're married with wine. They've been drinking for, you know, better part of 6 months, having this huge feast. And they make this irrational decision, because we're going to come to chapter 2 and notice some things here. So I have that written here in verse 19, and focus on that phrase, let another come to this royal position who's better than she. When you go to chapter 4 and look at verses 13 and 14, which we will next week, when it says, how do you know you've not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? The word kingdom, it can be translated royal position. Matter of fact, the New American Standard translates it that way. So you see this secular, really terrible situation where a woman is going to be exploited. But even in this circumstance, God is moving pieces around providentially behind the scenes to put Esther into power. Now, exit Vashti, enter Esther. Now, the text simply says, after these things. When I'm reading my Bible, I often look at like chapters. It's like the next day, you know, if you're reading along, if you don't really pay attention to what's going on here and look at the time clues that's found here, you may read it that way. There are 4 years, maybe 3, probably most likely 4 years between chapter 1 and chapter 2. Because let's notice the time stamps in the text, okay? If you look at chapter 1 and verse 3, it is the 3rd year, okay? If you go to chapter 2 and verse 16, this is, if you look at the very end of that verse, this is in the 7th year of his reign, okay? And so it's taken a considerable amount of time. Secular history helps us understand why Ahasuerus' attitude has changed significantly from chapter 1. He feels like he's on top of the earth, ruler of all the earth. But in chapter 2, you see a much, much different man. Well, during this time, Xerxes tried to take over Greece, and his army was defeated and they were run out. And so he comes back to Susa, defeated. He has a harem of women to choose from, but he's not wanting his harem of women. He's wanting his wife, Vashti, and he's beginning to miss her. And so you see a man who was and full of himself in chapter 1, chapter 2, bring in some world history that's going on here. You see a man that was quite defeated. And I like the way that Charles Swindoll pointed this out. I was going to read this to you. It said, the mighty lion king of Persia is a classic case in the point of humility. He appeared at the beginning of the story to be so powerful and significant, winds up drunk, is threatened by his wife's resistance, and is scrambling to stay in charge. I thought that was a pretty good description of what's going on here. So you have this man, he's humbled himself. He has this first major defeat in his time as king. He thought he could take over the whole earth, but he couldn't. The Greeks withstood him. And so what you notice here as the story progresses in chapter 2 is that God is with Israel, because the story turns away from this mighty man in this palace to this young Jewish girl. Okay, so the idea is there's going to be the first episode of The Bachelor, if you will, here that's going to happen in Susa. Okay, these girls are going to go through, they're going to get makeovers. They're for a whole year. You think about a whole year of makeovers, and they bring him before the king, and he's going to choose one. Okay, but notice verse 5. Now there was a Jew. Think about the way the story is progressing in this. And now there was a Jew in Susa, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, son of Kish, the Benjamite. And he carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, away from Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, and the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. A young woman, had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And her father and her mother died, and Mordecai took her as her own daughter. So the king's order and edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered to Susa in the citadel in the custody of Hegai, Esther was taken to the king's palace in the custody of Hegai, who was in charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with cosmetics and a portion of food, with 7 young women from the king's place, and advanced her and the young women to the best place in the harem. Verse 10 says she had not made it known that she was a Jew. The way chapter 2 reads, it seems there was something about Esther's character that won respect. Matter of fact, the king notices this. If you skip down to verse 15, notice what happens when Esther comes before the king. When her turn came to go to the king, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, he had taken her as his own daughter to go into the king. She asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now, Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. The idea of winning favor, if you look it up in the original, it means like gaining respect. It wasn't that they said, well, look at that beautiful young lady. There was something about her character that impressed people. Verse 16 says, when Esther was taken to Ahasuerus and to his royal palace in the 10th month, the month of Tibeth, the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women. So there's something about this young lady that gains not only the king's respect, but also all who were there. And notice this man, he's an unsung hero in the story, this Hegai, who's taken an interest in Esther and helps her ascend to that position. So you see all these moving parts that God is placing to put a Jew into a very powerful position, not in just the harem, but the queen. Let's notice the second thing going on here. Apart from this story, if you look at the end of the chapter, we read about Mordecai. So Mordecai, being a relative of now the queen of the Medes and the Persian, is apparently given some type of position. He's able to be at the gate, or at least in the courtyard of the palace, and he undercovers a plot And this is going to come back later in the story, come back to a very big deal because something happens in chapter 5, I believe it is. And he uncovers a plot. He reports it, the assassination, and the two men are caught and they are hanged as a result of this. And it's written down in the King's Chronicles. Now, so in this story, this great king's looking for a wife. He brings Esther into this position, and in almost overnight, it seems, you have two Jews that are in very powerful positions. Now, let's look at some application from this. How God works in uneventful times. There's nothing eventful about any of this, if you think about it. You know, did Esther know what was going on as she's this Jewish girl living in Susa as under captive? Well, probably not. Did King Ahasuerus even know who Mordecai was? Most likely not till later. Okay. And so we see these uneventful things that are just kind of culminating in this story and showing perhaps how God works behind the scenes. You know, when it comes to us, you think about events that are taking place in our own lives. And when we look back on those events, we say, you know what, there were doors opening and closing in our lives, and God blessed us by, you know, we thought it was painful and we left a certain situation, but it wound up being better for us because you fill in the blank for whatever that is. I remember that first year, if Tiffany was looking for a teaching job, and she had some opportunities in Florence to do the certified work. And I don't know, there was something in my gut that said, man, I don't want her driving to Florence every morning, you know. You know, I just told her, and then a teaching aid position came open, you know, at the elementary school, which was nothing in compared to the pay, right? If you're familiar with that pay scale. It did provide insurance for us, and she didn't make much. And I just said, look, you got to take that A job. She thought I was nuts. I thought I was nuts. I was like, you got to take that A job, you know, but that's opened some doors for her later. You know, you know, it kept her from having to, you know, go out of town. So sometimes in those uneventful times, and she's been able to bless some people's lives through working through that. And it's been interesting to watch. But 3 points I'd like to notice right here quickly: how God works in uneventful times. Number one, God's plans are not hindered when the events of the world are carnal and secular. I think, would you guys agree we live in probably the most secular time in your lives? Would you agree with that? What do you think? Has there been a time in your life you thought, you know, things are cyclical? Do we live in the most secular time in American history? Don, you got, is that a thumb up? Oh, I don't know if you're
Yeah.
going to say. Yeah. Uh, I
With
think,
the media coverage and so much technology and ways that we can share things, you know, it could be, it's not worse, but it's just that we know more about it.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, it's not that it's worse, right? It's just that it's everywhere, right? Every time we turn around, we get on social media and there's just something there. And you know, I'm very rarely shocked by things anymore, but you know, it seems like, where is God during all this? We got riots and everything that happened in Atlanta yesterday and Friday, and you think, man, it just seems like one thing after another. What about the situation here in Esther chapters 1 and 2? A drunken 180-day party where a man tries to treat his wife in a terrible, terrible way. And even though all these things are going on, you know, God is still at work. You know, God is not limited to working in the lives of Christians, right? There are people. His influences reach in the Middle East. It reaches in countries where we may not realize it. Iran, China. Think about going. I remember going to Burma. Those of us who were, I say even now, blessed the opportunity to go to old Burma. It's much different now. In some ways. In some ways, it's still the same. But you know, but you think about countries that they're not even on our radar screen. God is still working there, and still providentially perhaps opening doors to preach the gospel and so forth. Point being is, just because our world is increasingly carnal or secular doesn't mean that God has stopped working providentially. And you see that in this story here. And we see his influence. He's still sovereign. He's still reigning. He's still ruling. One of the great pictures of this in the Bible is Revelation 4. Revelation 2 and 3, 7 churches. Man, they're going through a lot of stuff. And the first picture of God we see in Revelation is chapter 4. Even though there's turmoil, persecution, sinful influences on the earth, God is still on his throne, reigning, ruling sovereignly. And I think we need to be reminded of that. Another thing is this. I got to click the right one. God's purposes are not frustrated by moral or marital failures. This situation is just a moral train wreck in chapter 1. And you think about the scene there amongst those drunken men, calling for the queen to come, and the queen of all people. You think about that thought too, the queen to fall her, put her reputation in disrepute by doing this. It was just, boy, I tell you, just because we mess up or there's sinful influences doesn't mean that God's purposes are frustrated by those things. A third and final thing is that God's people are not excluded from high places because of hardship or handicap. If you look at Esther's situation, it seemed pretty hopeless. She's an orphan. She's in exile. She is basically raised by a relative, a cousin of her family. They took her in. But at the same time, she was able to get into a position of influence. And also Mordecai, a Jew, there's a reason Esther didn't let people know she was a Jew. They were not looked upon favorably often. So here's Mordecai. He also, as we'll know the story continues, he's going to ascend into a position of authority as well. So chapters 1 and 2, I think, teach us a little bit about providence, and that God's plans are not hindered when things in this world maybe aren't going in a way that we would like for them to go or a way we think they should go. Any comments or questions about these things this afternoon? Well, I hope the lesson our study together was helpful in some way. We'll meet again next week at 2:00. We'll keep it at 2:00, and I'll record it as well. This way people can have access to it. I think I've got a chat here. Hang on. This thing is just about locked up on me. Let's see if I can get it going here. If I can stop share. Give me just a second. I hope that everybody.
I like these Old Testament studies.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot to. The books, I have not gotten those in yet. I'll have a little book for you guys to look at. This book here, it's written by. Let me get through recording. This book here is